January 1942. A forest in the depths of the Eastern Front. Snow falls silently, thick and unbroken, blanketing the shattered landscape. A lone figure moves cautiously through the trees. His uniform is tattered, boots frozen solid, and breath steaming in the frigid air. Every step is an effort, each crunch of snow beneath his feet a potential beacon to unseen eyes. He pauses, listening. A distant crack of ice, a muted voice carried by the wind. Enemy or ally, he cannot tell. Hunger gnaws at his stomach. Frostbite numbs his fingers, yet he keeps moving, slipping behind pines, ducking beneath low branches, following instinct more than strategy. He is cut off from his unit. Alone. Unarmed, save for a rifle that has fired its last round. The forest is vast, the enemy is patient. The cold is relentless. Survival will depend not on orders, but on cunning, endurance, and the smallest acts of mercy in a world ruled by snow and war. By the winter of 1941–42, the Eastern Front had become a frozen hell. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had initially brought the German army deep into Soviet territory. Cities fell, villages were burned, and thousands of kilometers were crossed. But with winter came delay, exhaustion, and unanticipated resistance. The forests of Russia were no longer neutral terrain, they became deadly traps. Snow drifted into trenches, obscured tracks, and slowed troop movements. Supply lines, stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, faltered. Units ran short of food, warm clothing, and ammunition. Frostbite claimed more limbs than bullets. Soldiers learned to fear the silence of the forest as much as the enemy hiding within it. France, a young German infantryman, had been part of a company tasked with holding a forward position near the small town of Vyazma. Soviet counteroffensives were gaining momentum, and German units were increasingly isolated. Patrols became scarce, orders chaotic, and retreat paths uncertain. Many soldiers found themselves cut off, forced to navigate forests in blizzards with little more than instinct to guide them. Behind the German front lines, partisan groups moved freely. They disrupted supply routes, ambushed stragglers, and guided Red Army detachments through terrain familiar only to them. For an isolated soldier like France, every step carried the risk of encountering a hidden enemy. Every rustle in the trees could be fatal. Survival demanded stealth, endurance, and a profound understanding of the forest's silent rhythms. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers had to endure not just the cold, hunger, and constant threat of death, but also profound isolation. The mind, left to its own devices, became a battlefield of fear, hallucination, and memory. Letters from home, once a source of comfort, seemed distant and unreal. Friends vanished into snowdrifts or enemy hands. Time itself stretched and warped in the endless white wilderness. Even as the forest held him in its frozen grip, France's story was part of a larger tapestry, a winter campaign that would decide the fates of thousands of men, testing endurance, morale, and the very limits of human survival. The German army, highly disciplined and mechanized, was built for rapid movement, not for the frozen expanse of the Russian winter. Vehicles froze, engines stalled, and horses used to pull supply wagons succumbed to frostbite. Soldiers improvised with what little they had, layering uniforms, melting snow for water, and scavenging whatever food remained. Yet these measures could only delay the inevitable suffering that came with prolonged exposure. Soviet forces, by contrast, had adapted to the climate. Winter camouflage, skis, and knowledge of the terrain allowed Red Army patrols to move with alarming efficiency. Entire forests could be traversed unseen, ambushes set in minutes, and retreating German units could be tracked over miles of snow. The forest became a chessboard, with France as a solitary pawn navigating both danger and opportunity. Partisans played a significant role in this winter campaign. Local guides, familiar with hidden paths, warned Soviet units of German movements and targeted supply lines. For soldiers like France, the partisans were a constant, unpredictable threat, appearing and disappearing like shadows among the trees. Even a small mistake, a snapped branch, a misstep in deep snow, could reveal one's position. Survival meant understanding the environment in ways that went beyond training, predicting wind patterns, reading snow tracks, and using silence as a shield. Morale was eroded by isolation. Soldiers trapped behind enemy lines often reported auditory hallucinations, whispers in the wind, phantom commands, or imagined footsteps. Hunger and exhaustion blurred time, days and nights merged in the white monotony of the snow. Some men became convinced they were being followed constantly, while others lost all hope and surrendered to the cold. For France, every decision, when to rest, when to move, when to hide, carried the weight of life or death. This backdrop of environmental cruelty, relentless enemy pursuit, and psychological strain set the stage for France's story. Alone in the forests, with supply lines gone and comrades lost, he faced a test far beyond the battlefield. It was a test of cunning, patience, and endurance, the harshest survival challenge of the Eastern Front. France's struggle in the snow was not just physical, it was profoundly psychological. Starvation gnawed at his stomach, frostbite numbed his extremities, and exhaustion blurred his perception. Each step carried the weight of his mortality. Soldiers cut off from their units often described the forest as alive, whispering threats with every wind gust, every cracking branch. France learned to fight not only against the environment, but also against despair. His survival depended on controlling fear, rationing his energy, and making decisions in which hesitation could be fatal. Every tree, hollow, and snowdrift became both shelter and trap, and he adapted through a combination of instinct and experience. From a tactical perspective, isolation transformed France's approach to survival. Stripped of coordination with his unit, he relied entirely on reconnaissance of his immediate environment. Snow tracks, broken branches, and distant smoke guided his movements. Encounters with enemy patrols demanded stealth, patience, and improvisation. He learned to use the forest's natural contours to evade detection, selecting routes that minimized exposure while maximizing the possibility of finding shelter or food. Each decision had immediate consequences. A wrong turn could lead directly into Soviet forces, while careful observation allowed him to outmaneuver patrols that would have overrun larger groups of soldiers. Leadership, or rather, its absence, was central to France's ordeal. Cut off from his command structure, he had to assume responsibility for his own survival, without orders. He became his own strategist, medic, and provider. Decisions normally made at the company or platoon level, when to move, how to forage, when to hide, fell solely on his shoulders. This autonomy tested not only his tactical skills, but also his resilience and mental fortitude. The lessons of leadership in isolation were stark. Initiative, observation, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure often determined who survived and who did not. Soviet forces operating in the winter forest were relentless. Small, mobile patrols could cover miles quickly on skis, using local knowledge to track and ambush stragglers. France faced an enemy whose strength lay not in numbers alone, but in adaptation to the environment. Understanding their patterns, how far they would venture, which trails they might use, where fires would be lit, became essential to survival. His knowledge of enemy behavior allowed him to exploit gaps in their patrols and avoid encounters that would have been fatal. France had little to rely on in terms of technology. His rifle was empty, his uniform shredded, and equipment frozen solid. Radios, vehicles, and mechanized support were absent in the deep forest. Survival depended on understanding rudimentary tools, using a small knife to scrape ice from branches, improvising snowshoes from planks or branches, and melting snow for water in a tin cup. These minimal tools became extensions of his body, each action calculated for efficiency and endurance. Even the simplest piece of technology, a match, a stove, a fragment of cloth, could mean life or death in the frozen landscape. Isolation forced France into difficult moral decisions. When he discovered the woman and child hiding in a nearby shack, he could have ignored them or taken resources for himself. Instead, he shared what little he had, understanding that survival was not only about physical endurance, but about preserving a sense of humanity. Acts of compassion in such extreme conditions were rare, yet they became critical anchors that sustained his spirit. The forest was indifferent, and the enemy ruthless, but small moral choices preserved not just life, but sanity. The winter environment was the greatest adversary. Temperatures frequently dropped below degrees C, snowdrifts reached chest height, and visibility was limited by blizzards. Every movement demanded energy, every rest risked frostbite. Rivers and lakes froze unevenly, creating hidden hazards, while forests obscured both threats and paths to safety. France had to read the land with precision, tracking enemy patrols through footprints, predicting avalanches or ice collapse, and finding shelter that balanced concealment with warmth. Nature was as lethal as any soldier, and his survival depended on understanding its subtle signals. Prolonged isolation imposed extreme psychological strain. France's mind oscillated between hope and despair, often mistaking natural sounds for threats. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and fear of capture magnified hallucinations and intensified anxiety. His resilience depended on mental discipline, breaking the day into small objectives, focusing on immediate tasks like melting snow or finding shelter, and suppressing panic. The forest, with its white monotony, became both enemy and classroom, teaching him endurance, patience, and the limits of human will. France's survival was a confluence of human endurance, tactical knowledge, environmental mastery, moral choices, and psychological resilience. Days of wandering had brought France to the edge of exhaustion. Hunger clawed at his stomach. Frostbite stiffened his fingers and toes, yet every step forward was essential. The forest that had sheltered him now threatened to betray him. Tracks in the snow suggested Soviet patrols were closing in, methodical and relentless. He paused beneath a fallen tree, listening to the wind. A distant crunch of snow. Voices, 3 men, moving carefully, scanning the forest floor. France's rifle was empty. Every instinct screamed to remain still, yet staying put might be as deadly as moving. He retraced steps along hidden paths, circling around the patrol's likely route. Each tree, each mound of snow, became a shield. He crawled under branches, slid down shallow ravines, and learned to move without sound. The forest was alive with danger, every shadow a potential enemy. Hours passed. The patrol's voices faded, but France knew they had not abandoned the search. They were trained to track, to follow the faintest trace. He relied on his memory of terrain, subtle deviations in the snow, and instinct honed through days of isolation. One wrong step could expose him entirely. Suddenly, through a clearing, he spotted a small cabin, half buried in snow. Smoke curled from the chimney. It could offer warmth or a trap. France approached cautiously, analyzing footprints in the snow. Recent Cyrillic characters etched into the wooden beams hinted that Soviet soldiers had used it. The risk was enormous. He could not linger, yet the shelter was too vital to ignore. Inside, the remnants of a stove and scattered crates offered potential heat. France gathered splinters of wood and lit a small fire. Smoke curled into the cold air, but was quickly smothered by snow to avoid detection. Warmth seeped into his frozen fingers. He thawed snow for water, his body regaining a fraction of its strength. Then he noticed it, a red cloth hidden under frost, a fragment of a Soviet armband. The cabin was recently used. Patrols could return at any moment. France's momentary respite became a tense countdown. Every noise, the creak of timber, the howl of wind, felt like a warning. He extinguished the fire, smothering embers with snow, and prepared to move. The forest was no longer just an adversary, it was a gauntlet. Outside, distant shouts and flashes of movement confirmed the patrol's proximity. France adjusted his route, moving deeper into the trees with a singular purpose, to evade detection while inching toward any sign of safety. Survival now demanded total focus, every decision weighing life against death. The pursuit was not random, it was a calculated hunt, and France understood that the next steps would define whether he would endure or perish in the frozen wilderness. France moved cautiously through a narrow ravine, snow crunching faintly beneath his boots. The forest, once a protective shroud, now funneled him into a trap. Soviet patrols advanced with methodical precision, their voices echoing off frozen rocks. Every shadow could be a rifle barrel, every rustle a warning. He spotted movement ahead, 3 soldiers, young and alert, scanning the ravine floor. France weighed his options. Retreat would expose his trail, confrontation risked immediate death. His rifle was still empty. The forest had taught him one principle above all: patience. A sudden idea struck him. He grabbed a small branch and threw it into a clearing, a decoy. The soldiers reacted instantly, aiming and moving toward the sound. France used the distraction, sliding behind a boulder deeper in the ravine. His heart pounded. Frostbitten fingers clutched his empty rifle, every nerve alert. Gunfire erupted. France's aim was precise but limited. He fired only when an enemy soldier moved into the narrowest angle of the ravine, relying on the terrain to offset his disadvantage. Snow exploded around him from ricocheting bullets. Each maneuver was a calculated risk. One misstep, one miscalculation, and he would be gone. Suddenly, a larger figure appeared at the ravine's edge, a Soviet sergeant surveying the chaos. He raised his rifle, shouting commands. The other soldiers hesitated. France, trembling, realized that he could not hold the ravine indefinitely. Escape was the only option. He ran, snow sprayed from beneath his boots. Branches whipped across his face. Gunfire cracked behind him. The sergeant shouted, but the patrol could not advance without risk in the narrow terrain. France knew the ravine's twists and turns better than anyone, and that knowledge became his shield. Then a decisive moment. The sergeant fired, not at him, but into the opposite slope of the ravine. A warning shot. The soldiers froze. The sergeant's commanding presence communicated something unspoken. France was no longer the immediate threat. Breathing heavily, France moved past the frozen rocks and out of the ravine, every step a negotiation with survival. The Soviet soldiers did not pursue further. For a moment, the forest fell silent once more. France's ordeal had reached a turning point, not through firepower, but through cunning, endurance, and the fragile mercy of a soldier who recognized another human in desperate circumstances. France moved cautiously through a narrow ravine, snow crunching faintly beneath his boots. The forest, once a protective shroud, now funneled him into a trap. Soviet patrols advanced with methodical precision, their voices echoing off frozen rocks. Every shadow could be a rifle barrel, every rustle a warning. He spotted movement ahead, 3 soldiers, young and alert, scanning the ravine floor. France weighed his options. Retreat would expose his trail, confrontation risked immediate death. His rifle was still empty. The forest had taught him one principle above all: patience. A sudden idea struck him. He grabbed a small branch and threw it into a clearing, a decoy. The soldiers reacted instantly, aiming and moving toward the sound. France used the distraction, sliding behind a boulder deeper in the ravine. His heart pounded. Frostbitten fingers clutched his empty rifle, every nerve alert. Gunfire erupted. France's aim was precise but limited. He fired only when an enemy soldier moved into the narrowest angle of the ravine, relying on the terrain to offset his disadvantage. Snow exploded around him from ricocheting bullets. Each maneuver was a calculated risk. One misstep, one miscalculation, and he would be gone. Suddenly, a larger figure appeared at the ravine's edge, a Soviet sergeant surveying the chaos. He raised his rifle, shouting commands. The other soldiers hesitated. France, trembling, realized that he could not hold the ravine indefinitely. Escape was the only option. He ran, snow sprayed from beneath his boots. Branches whipped across his face. Gunfire cracked behind him. The sergeant shouted, but the patrol could not advance without risk in the narrow terrain. France knew the ravine's twists and turns better than anyone, and that knowledge became his shield. Then a decisive moment. The sergeant fired, not at him, but into the opposite slope of the ravine. A warning shot. The soldiers froze. The sergeant's commanding presence communicated something unspoken. France was no longer the immediate threat. Breathing heavily, France moved past the frozen rocks and out of the ravine, every step a negotiation with survival. The Soviet soldiers did not pursue further. For a moment, the forest fell silent once more. France's ordeal had reached a turning point, not through firepower, but through cunning, endurance, and the fragile mercy of a soldier who recognized another human in desperate circumstances. France stumbled through a narrow trail, following the faint outline of footprints he hoped belonged to Soviet units. Each snap of a branch, each crunch of snow beneath boots made his pulse race. After days of solitude, he realized that capture might be the only route to immediate shelter and warmth. He encountered a Soviet patrol near a small clearing. Instinct told him to hide, but exhaustion and frostbite left him unable to flee. Hands raised, he called out in halting German. Soldiers trained to react quickly, rifles ready, paused. A sergeant approached cautiously, scrutinizing Franz's frost-covered uniform and hollow eyes. For a tense moment, silence dominated the clearing. Then the sergeant gestured for him to follow, no words of accusation, no immediate hostility. Franz understood. The choice to spare him had been made. The camp was modest. Tents half buried in snow, small fires burning weakly, soldiers huddled around them. Franz was led to a medical tent, where a medic examined him. Frostbite, dehydration, malnutrition, the list was long, yet the assessment was pragmatic, not punitive. Franz's survival was acknowledged quietly, without fanfare. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the world in white. The soldiers who had once been his hunters now became the keepers of his fragile life. He received food, warmth, and for the first time in weeks, safety. After several days of recovery, the sergeant guided Franz to a narrow road leading deeper behind Soviet lines. No chains, no escort beyond necessary guidance. A small piece of bread was handed over, a gesture heavier with meaning than any rifle shot could convey. Franz walked slowly, snow crunching underfoot. Every step took him away from immediate danger, but toward an uncertain fate, reintegration into German lines, scrutiny from command, and the psychological burden of having survived alone. The forest receded behind him. Each tree, ravine, and snowdrift carried lessons in endurance, vigilance, and humanity. Franz understood that survival was not a singular moment, but a chain of choices, each reliant on observation, cunning, and sometimes mercy. Franz returned to German-controlled territory changed. The forests, the ravine, the snow, they were etched into his body and mind. Each frostbitten finger, each scarred ankle, each hollow stare testified to months of survival under conditions most men could not endure. Yet the war outside the forest continued, indifferent to the battles he had survived in silence. Franz approached a small outpost, cautious and weary. Soldiers on patrol eyed him with suspicion. Papers in tatters, uniform frozen and torn, he explained his separation from his unit. Questions came quickly. Where had he been? What did he witness? What supplies did he carry? Each answer was met with scrutiny. Desertion was a constant fear in command, and men who reappeared after weeks or months behind enemy lines often faced suspicion or punishment. Yet Franz's story, marked by frost, exhaustion, and survival against impossible odds, spoke for itself. He had no embellishments, no triumphs to boast of, only a clear account of isolation, struggle, and endurance. The officers, recognizing both the plausibility and fragility of his tale, allowed him reintegration. He was alive, counted once more in the machinery of the army. Recovery was slow. Frostbite required careful treatment, malnutrition demanded gradual replenishment. Every meal, every warm layer of clothing restored strength but did not erase memory. Franz slept under blankets, yet dreams were haunted by the forest. Muzzle flashes, the crunch of snow, the sergeant's warning, the hidden child he had protected. The quiet endurance of the forest became as vivid as any battlefield engagement, and in many ways more demanding. Even after returning to German lines, Franz's journey was far from over. The war continued, and so did its pressures. Command structures demanded explanations, units expected performance, and the bureaucracy of survival, papers, reports, reintegration, loomed large over a man who had lived on instinct for months. The isolation of the forest had prepared him for nature, the enemy, and himself, but it could not prepare him for suspicion from his own side. Franz recounted his journey to his superiors. Every detail, his movements, the encounters, the tactics employed to evade capture was scrutinized. Officers compared his account to maps, patrol records, and known enemy positions. Questions were sharp, but Franz answered steadily, relying on memory sharpened by days of life-and-death observation. The verification was slow. Mistakes could have led to accusations of desertion, a charge often punished harshly in wartime. Finally, after careful review, he was allowed back into the fold. He was no longer lost, no longer invisible, but the forest and snow remained imprinted in his body and mind. Every movement, sound, and shadow had a lesson. Every step had been a negotiation with mortality. Even as he moved back into the structure of the army, Franz carried the forest with him. Every instinct, every careful observation, every decision to act or remain still had been sharpened by months of survival. The lessons of the Eastern Front went beyond tactics or orders. They were about endurance, morality, and the fragile balance between life and death in a world stripped to its most elemental challenges. Franz's story is a testament to the human spirit under extreme duress. The forest tested him beyond physical limits, the enemy hunted him relentlessly, and isolation pushed him to the brink. Yet he endured, carrying the lessons of the forest into the uncertain world beyond. Even in the harshest winters and the cruelest wars, humanity can survive. Survival is endurance. Survival is moral courage. Survival is the quiet, relentless assertion of life against overwhelming odds. The snow melts, the forests fall silent, and history moves forward. But the stories of endurance, like Franz's, remain eternal, echoing the delicate balance between survival, morality, and humanity in the face of war.